Hello, everyone, and welcome to Literary Terms Cards with Angie. All right, we're going to do cards 20A through the end of 27, and I'm probably going to go too quickly for you, so just pause it and write it as you need to, and I'll explain them as we go. Okay. This first one this goes with poetry, and this is one of those that hardly ever shows up, but they'll ask a question or two in the multiple choice, so I wanted you to at least have it. So in poetry, and this is only going to be in poetry, you'll see poets that will have a certain pattern to their syllable use. And so in this, and I'll pronounce them for you in a second, the X stands for unstressed, and then the backslash is stressed. So an I am would have one foot where the first syllable is unstressed and the second one is stressed. A trochee will have a stressed syllable followed by an unstressed. An anapest will have 3 syllables in its foot, and it's unstressed, unstressed, stress. And a dactyl will also have 3, and it is stressed, unstressed, unstressed. A spondee is a foot of just 2 syllables, and that's stress, stress. And pyrrhic is 2 syllables, unstressed, unstressed. And if I were going to guess on these, I would say dactyl, spondee, and I am tend to be the ones that if they're going to ask about, those are the ones they will. Poetry term, metaphysical conceit. These are in poetry, again, only poetry, where 2 very different objects are compared. And I've given you an example here from John Donne, where he compares his love's soul to his foot that isn't leaving the ground. Metonymy. Metonymy is a substitute term used to refer to something like the crown for the king. So it's where you have a different term that refers to the noun itself. Like you could say the White House for the president, and that would be metonymy. A monologue. This is 20D, monologue. And it is a long speech by a single character. Often they're on stage alone, and usually a monologue can often be set by itself. And if we were going to find something, say on the multiple choice part, or maybe even on the prose essay, you might see a monologue where you have to go through and discuss what it is this character in the play is just, their focus of the monologue is. Okay, easy one, mood. And we're on 20E. And mood is the prevailing atmosphere of a work. Motif. So you guys have had a lot of trouble deciding the difference between a motif and a theme. One way to remember it is a motif is going to be something like small, like a word, whereas a theme is going to be written more as a longer phrase or a sentence. So a motif is a thread or idea that is throughout a work and either significant as a symbol or as an extended metaphor. An example would be madness in Hamlet is a motif. A narrative. You can have any sort of a story, book, that can be a narrative. And then you can have narrative poetry, which is poetry that tells a story. Narrative technique. And that would be an author's style of telling a story, whether it be formal or informal, or perhaps in letter form or diary form, or even a story within a story, like a frame story. Those are all narrative techniques. An ode is a kind of poem, and so it is a complex lyric poem, often on a serious subject and often nature. And the odes were very popular during the Romantic period, so from about 1798 to about 1832, to maybe 1833. Poets like Percy Shelley, Lord Byron, John Keats, William Wordsworth, these were romantic poets who were known for writing poetry that focused on the independence of man, man's free will, and the idea that man could find joy and peace in nature. And so with the Romantic movement came a lot of odes. Onomatopoeia. And that's the imitation of sounds, like buzz or woof. Great, the cat went crazy. An oxymoron. A figure of speech that suggests a paradox. And remember, a paradox is just a contradiction. And guess what? Paradox, which is a self-contradicting statement. So anything that when you say it, you're automatically saying something that is contradictory in itself. In, say, The Things They Carried, in the story, The Man I Killed, when Tim kills the man and is telling the story, in the multiple different ways that he killed the man, and Kiowa comes to Tim and he says, don't worry about it, it was a good kill. That's very paradoxical, because how could any kill be a good one? Parallelism. And that's a repetition of words or phrases to emphasize organization. In poetry, you might see parallel structure, where there's a certain kind of line at the beginning of the poem and then a certain kind of line at the end. And you can also have parallel structure in, say, short stories and chapters in novels. A parody, we're on 22D, parody, which is a work of ridicule. And generally, that's where you are poking fun at someone else's work. Keep in mind, we had the poem Passionate Shepherd to His Love, and then the parody or the ridiculing one was the nymph's reply to the shepherd. Pedantic. And if something is pedantic, it's scholarly or academic writing. So journals, as you guys will encounter those in college, you'll find a lot of writing that's pedantic, meaning it's professors that have written things. Often academics, meaning people who spend time at the university whose job it is to research and review. Academics will focus on pedantic writing in order to advance their career and to advance whatever topic it is that they're working on. Persona, we're at 23A. A persona is the mask or the version of self that an author projects in a particular text. And I would say the best example we've had of this year would be Tim O'Brien and The Things They Carried. And remember, we've always got narrator Tim versus the real Tim O'Brien. And he never really takes off the mask of narrator Tim, so we don't really know what real Tim O'Brien, the author, really is or who he really is. Personification. Taking you way back to the 3rd grade. Giving an object human qualities. Like right now, there is a cat. Oh, look, there she is, howling like a banshee. So I just personified my cat, calling her a banshee. You have to look up what a banshee is, though. There it was again. A phonetic intensive, 23C. A word whose sound somehow implies its meaning. And that is that the word itself, it sounds positive, or the word itself sounds negative. And we could get very specific with this, but they don't tend to ask that sort of thing on the test. So I would worry just mostly about positive and negative connotation, but keep in mind that sometimes the word itself just sounds positive or just sounds negative. Like harmony or melody, those sound very positive. They got a positive connotation, whereas vomit has a very negative connotation as well. Okay, going way back to 3rd grade again. Point of view, you have first person, I, third person limited, where you have a narrator who has like a single view or can look through the view of a single character's lens, and you have third person omniscient, and that's where you have an all-knowing narrator, so they know and can see all of the characters. All right, and point of view, you have either objective or dramatic point of view. And in this case, it's third person, but the author doesn't interrupt behavior or thoughts of characters. So in this case, with objective or dramatic point of view, again, it is third person, but the narrator stays outside of the story and allows the characters to have their own dialogue and conversation without having the narrator insert his or her own thoughts. Polysyndeton, we're at 24a. Polysyndeton is where several coordinating conjunctions join parts of a text, and this is fairly common both in prose and poetry. So I gave you an example from prose, so this is Charles Dickens. There were hills and cowhouses and dunghills and dust heaps and ditches and gardens and summer houses at the very door. And so the conjunction and would be the example of polysyndeton. Polysyndeton. We're at 24b with prose. I think you would know this one by now, but okay, so it's fiction and nonfiction writing. Prose is anything that isn't poetry. And do keep in mind that some of our terms are only poetry related. It seems like occasionally in our conversations we kind of get lost in that, and we're mentioning terms that are only poetry focused. So we're not going to have things like meter or really even rhyme or stressed and unstressed syllables and patterns and that sort of thing. We're not going to have that in prose. We'll only have that in poetry. A protagonist is the main character around whom a narrative or a dramatic work centers. Please don't fall into the mistakes thinking that your protagonist is always a good person or a good character. That's not always true. Repetition. And that's just simply the duplication of any element of language. So the difference between repetition and parallel structure is repetition is going to literally repeat the word or the phrase, whereas parallel structure, it's just a pattern that is used again, not necessarily or definitely not the same words. Make sure you understand the difference between parallelism / parallel structure and repetition. Rhetoric. This word was used some in Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, and I think not everybody understood what it meant or how to pronounce it. So rhetoric. And rhetoric is the rules that define effective writing. So for you to have rhetoric to your writing, you have to be following all the rules for grammar and conventions and punctuation, as well as what's a complete sentence and what's not a complete sentence. How a paragraph is set up with the topic sentence and supporting sentences. All of those things together form rhetoric because those are rules that go into making formal writing. A rhetorical pause, on 25a, is just a natural pause, and it's the exact same thing as a caesura. So a rhetorical pause and a caesura are the same thing. Often you'll notice these in poetry in particular, where there's a semicolon or a period in the middle of a line. At the end of a line, not so much, because those are natural places to stop. So when they put the natural pause in the middle of the line, it was to give the reader time to breathe, or to maybe give the speaker time to breathe, or the reader time to process the idea. So rhetorical pause and caesura, same thing. Remember on our plot line, think of it as the mountain. The rising action is the second part of the mountain, and the rising action is just simply the intensifying of the plot. So you have exposition, rising action, third is the climax, fourth is the falling action, fifth is the resolution or the denouement. A round character is a character with multifaceted moral qualities. In other words, you see that character from all sides. The opposite of round is flat. So flat is where you just know one part of a character. Round is you know all of them. They're good, they're bad, how they behave around others, how they behave alone, etc. sarcasm, 25D. And this is bitter language used for ridicule in order to bring about some sort of change. And you could pretty much use this interchangeably with satire. Scansion. It's the measuring of verse or poetry. Okay, verse just means poetry. The measuring of verse by locating accented syllables and dividing into feet. And so at the beginning of the video, back when you had I am and tro she and spondee, all of those were just examples of scansion. So scansion is literally when the reader of the poem, scansion is only in poetry. So when the reader of the poem or the poet himself or herself has decided they're going to have X number of syllables in a line and, or X number of, or a pattern of stress and unstress in a line, when you go looking for it or you try to prove that it exists, you are exhibiting scansion. So it's something that you are doing as the reader of the poem. Okay, when you write, and this one probably takes you back to about 5th grade, you write 4 different kinds of sentences. Simple are just subject verb. And that one, if you want to get real technical, I like pizza is subject, verb, direct object. A compound sentence is just 2 sentences that could stand alone, but they're joined by a compound, a conjunction. I like pizza, comma, but I dislike soup. A complex sentence is a dependent clause and an independent clause. Because I like pizza, comma, I visited Italy. And then a compound complex has at least 2 dependent clauses and 1 independent clause. Though I like pizza, comma, I didn't order it because I had pasta instead. A sestina. A sestina is a kind of poem. And it's a poem of 6 stanzas with 6 lines each. And then the end of the poem has a final 3-line triplet. The end words of each one of the 6 stanzas are then rotated in a set pattern decided by the poet. And to find these, we're talking entire poems, and I wasn't going to write an entire poem on a little tiny index card. So if you need an example of a sestina, go to Google or go to Literary Terms Dictionary, and they'll give you some of the more popular poems. Hey, keep in mind when you're being asked about setting, it's really common for everyone to just assume that setting means time and place, but setting also means atmosphere. So if you're asked to discuss setting, as you often are, in a prose question or even an open question, question 3, think about the time that it's taking place in and keep that close in mind when it's taking place, not necessarily when it was written or published. And then you have to think about the place where it's taking place. And this might be a specific place. It could be a city or a country, it might be someplace that doesn't exist. It could be into the future. And then the atmosphere that surrounds it will be what sorts of people and what sorts of events are going into the setting of the story in particular, like the novel or the play. So I would say, let's say we're taking Things Fall Apart. So the time period is colonialism during Africa. It's probably the 19th century. The place is Africa, and it's in what is now modern-day Nigeria. And the atmosphere, I would say, would be the clash between tribal cultures and European colonizers. 26D is an English sonnet. Remember, another word for that is a Shakespearean sonnet. You've had that before. And a Shakespearean sonnet has 3 quatrains, so 3 stanzas that have 4 lines each, and then a couplet, or 2 lines. And so that's going to be 14 lines. Almost all sonnets have 14 lines. Bear in mind that just because it has 14 lines doesn't make it a sonnet. But if it is 14 lines and it follows one of these patterns, it's likely a sonnet. So it would, if it's a Shakespearean or an English sonnet, it's A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, E, F, G, G. And we looked at a particular Shakespearean sonnet, but you could look at any of his. Probably Shakespeare's more famous sonnets. There's Sonnet 130, which is actually a parody. He's calling his love all these horrible, awful things, and he doesn't mean it. There is Sonnet 76 and 78 that tend to be really popular. Sonnet 120 and Sonnet 29. But honestly, you could look up any of Shakespeare's sonnets and get a feel for what those look like. And Shakespeare has been credited with 154 sonnets in all. An Italian sonnet. This is our last one for this video. Okay, so in poetry, so again, it's a sonnet with 14 lines, but this one has an 8-line octave and a 6-line sestet. And there is a specific rhyming pattern for it as well that usually involves more of an interlocking rhyme scheme. And another word for an Italian sonnet is a Petrarchian sonnet. Petrarch is a philosopher and a writer, Petrarchian. And there is one other form of sonnet besides the English sonnet and the Italian sonnet, and that is what's called a Spenserian sonnet. And that one is actually 27A. So I lied, and I'm throwing this one in with this set because Spenserian sonnet is the same as an English sonnet, but with interlinking rhyme. And so a Spenserian will have that number of lines and those quatrains and couplet, but instead of it rhyming A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D, there'll be a specific pattern where it links as it moves in to one line to the next. And this is not necessarily, I don't give you the pattern on that one, on a Spenserian, because it is up to the poet himself or herself. So if it feels like it's a sonnet, it's 14 lines, but it doesn't have the English sonnet pattern, and it doesn't look like it's, the Italian octave sestet, then chances are it's a Spenserian. The only other kind of sonnet you could have is what we would call an almost sonnet, and you really could write about that if you wanted to. And an almost sonnet is maybe one that is 14 lines and just doesn't have the rhyming pattern, or one that feels like a sonnet but is 12 or 13 lines. And for example, some of our romantic poets wrote Percy Shelley and Ozymandias, which I believe we read when we were doing poetry the last time. Ozymandias is considered an almost sonnet because it doesn't quite meet the rules for it. Okay, guys, so that took you from 20A through 27A. So there's another small set that I'll do on another video in a few days, and then we'll be done, and you need to learn all of these, gosh, in like less than 2 months now. Good night. Bye.